Well, welcome to you hardy few who have joined us here today in Oakland. This is a meeting, first meeting of the Select Committee on Restoring California's Middle Class. I'm Senator Mark DeSaulnier. I represent the 7th Senate District in the California State Senate, which is just to the east of where we sit here in Oakland. It's all of Contra Costa County at the current point, except for the city of San Pablo, and then I split the city of Richmond with Senator Hancock, who has her offices upstairs, and I just left a meeting in Richmond with her, so we're hoping, if time allows, she'll be able to join us. None of the other committee members were able to join us, but I do think this, at least for me, obviously, since I asked for this committee, and I want to thank Senator Steinberg and leadership for allowing us to have the Select Committee, is an extremely, extremely important subject. Interest for me is probably long-term. Justice Brandeis, a fellow native of the state of Commonwealth of Massachusetts, when he was appointed on the U.S. Supreme Court by Franklin Roosevelt, he once famously said, "We can have democracy in America, or we can have a great deal of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but you can't have both." And it's nothing against, obviously, people being successful and accumulating wealth and great wealth. That's part of the American tradition, but a concern that, at least for me, and this is speaking strictly for myself, that as Kevin Phillips said, very prominent Republican, when he wrote Wealth and Democracy about 10, 15 years ago, he was very prophetic about, I think, about the state of our country, that if you didn't have a very vibrant middle income in the United States, it would inhibit democracy, just as Justice Brandeis mentioned in his comment. And Mr. Phillips has gone on as an economist and a historian and a prominent with a prominent understanding of politics and the history of politics in America and the West, has talked very vigorously about the importance of restoring the American middle class. So we know that post-World War II, the American middle class was booming. People came back from the war in Asia and in Europe. They came back to home ownership and vibrant careers, very high union membership, as I'm sure one of our panelists will tell us, and a lot of union peace, labor management peace, and prosperity. The economy was growing at over 6% in those years, in that decade, post-World War II. And we also have to be mindful of the fact that America was in a unique position, and that our competitors in the global manufacturing realm we're pretty much out of that competition, and as we know, our competitors now in Japan and in Europe, their manufacturing capacity that fueled the American middle class was largely gone. So we had a distinct advantage. Having said all that, it's still extremely important that we have a vibrant middle class, and how we restore that, I think, is a real challenge. So the purpose of this hearing is to frame the discussion. And we have great panelists here, so we'll go through two basic discussions with the same four panelists. Are we indeed in danger of losing the American middle class as we dreamed of it, and as I did as a member of the baby boomers when my dad came back from serving in the military and had 5 children? And then secondarily, what can we do about it? And what can we do about it at the state level? And even at the state level of a large state like California, are there things that we can do legislatively that would help restoring the American middle class? So with that, anyone in the audience who needs an agenda, we have some available. We have our 2 wonderful sergeants here with all of the material that we have available, that are available over here to the side. We'll go through the agenda as it's presented, so we'll just go in the order as each one is presented here. I do want to thank my staff person, Michael Miller, who organized this meeting and is the staff to this committee. And just let me end with, this is not to be too redundant, but I look at this as a starting point. I'm hopeful that some of my colleagues and I can have in the legislature, and hopefully on a bipartisan level, a series of bills, once we discover what it is that we can best do to address this problem, and a package of bills. So this is a starting point. We plan to have more hearings. When we go back in a session in January, we will introduce bills as we find appropriate. And then very lastly, I frequently do this, say lastly and continue on. But as someone who is a small business person, I really appreciate having Scott here today, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's not just employment. I look at small business people having still been in the restaurant business for about 35 years. This isn't just a management labor issue. It's really transcends all that because truly small business people and people in middle management and even in some upper management in large companies are affected by what's happened to the American middle class. So with that, we will start with our agenda, and we're going to start with Sarah Bone. If that's proper pronunciation, please correct me. She has her doctorate, and she's a policy fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome.
Thank you. I think we're working on getting the PowerPoint.
Pressure's on, Michael. You had plenty of time, Michael, when I was wandering, rambling. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I wanted to mention at the outset that I'm from the Public Policy Institute of California, which is a nonprofit research organization based in San Francisco. And our mission is to improve California public policy through nonpartisan, independent, objective research. I'll be talking today about the snapshot of California's middle class using the dimension of income to look at middle class families. And admittedly, this doesn't capture the full picture of what it means to be in the middle class. In particular, our measures exclude assets and wealth, but income does track pretty well with economic well-being overall, and so it's a good place to start and one dimension to look at middle class by. So how do we measure middle class in terms of income? The first way we look at this is just to track the median income in families in California, and that is the family at exactly the middle of the income distribution. And you can see over time that the median family in California has been doing really has been bouncing around between doing slightly better than they were in 1980 or slightly worse. There's no clear trend of strong growth in median family income in the state. In fact, by 2010, the median family in California is doing only as well as the median family in 1980, earning about $61,000. It's hard to see, you can't see on this chart at all, but if you compare the periods of economic recessions, you see that median incomes took a large hit in all the recessions. And in the current Great Recession, the median family took a hit of about 11%. The median family in California is actually doing worse than the median family in the rest of the country. Especially by 2010, you can see that in the rest of the country, the median family earned about $66,000, about $5,000 more than the median family in California. At the same time, you can see over the long term, so this is showing about 3 decades of growth in median family income in the rest of the country, whereas the trend in the median family income in California, there's no strong growth trend there. So the second way that we analyze the middle class in terms of income is not to look at just the middle family, but to define some kind of category of income that captures a broader set of people. And there's no consensus in the research literature on how to define middle income or middle class workers. So what we do at PPIC is use a definition that defines pretty much a consistent level of well-being over time, and then we track how many families fall into that range of economic well-being over time and who falls into that range. We use a ratio of the federal poverty level, which is a statistic developed that does actually consistently measure well-being, and we take between 2 and 7 times that level of income to define our middle income class. And that's equivalent to about a range of $45,000 to $150,000 per year for a family of 4. When we track how many families fall into that range over time, you can see a clear decline over the last 3 decades in middle income families in the state. That's the orange line below. If we adjust that number for the high cost of living in California, it's even a little bit worse. So in 1980, about 60% of California families were in the middle class by our definition. But by 2010, less than a majority are defined as middle class. You can see in the rest of the country that the share is a little bit higher, although there's also a slight decline trend over time for middle class in the rest of the country. So is this good or bad? If the share of middle income families is declining, that means that either more families are falling into the low income class, so below our definition, or more are falling into the high income class above our definition, or possibly both. What we've seen up until about the recession is that the trend was towards a net improvement, so that if you look at the percentage of families that are defined as high income, you see that that's growing. That's the darkest bar, growing between 1980, 1990, and 2000. At the same time, the percent of families who are considered low income was about the same or declining slightly. So it was what we would say is a net improvement in terms of the distribution of families falling more so into the high income group. But the Great Recession reversed that. So you see in the last set of columns there, the percentage of families considered low income grew, the percentage of families considered middle income shrunk, as well as high income. So the Great Recession had a strong effect on how families fall into these broad economic well-being categories. But this chart hides a little bit the fact that in addition to growing low income and growing high income over the period, growing shares, I should say, of those families, the actual level of income became more polarized. So low incomes tended to decline quite precipitously, and high incomes grew precipitously, exacerbating the disparity between rich and poor, or income inequality in the state. So a next way of looking at what is the middle class today in California, we take some demographic characteristics of middle income class families. And I'm sorry, you can't see all the numbers too clearly on this, but we find that the composition of California's middle income class reflects that of California overall. There's small differences by education, ethnicity, but they're pretty minor. You see that over 60% of middle income families were headed by somebody that had at least some college education. Only 11% were headed by a family that didn't have a high school degree. Almost 80% were in married families, so married with kids or married without kids. One group that is of particular concern to a lot of people is households that are headed by a single person with children, and of the middle class, only 10% fall into that category. Middle income families in California tend to be a little bit more likely to be white or Asian than in the population overall, but the differences aren't too striking. And a little bit more likely to be US born than immigrant, but again, the differences are not too striking. If you looked at the same pie charts for low income groups or high income groups, there's definitely a lot more skewness, in particular with regard to education. So next we look at where are middle income families living in the state. And there aren't really striking differences here either. In San Diego County, we find the highest rate of families falling into the middle class. That is about 56%. The lowest is in the San Joaquin region, where about 45% of families there are considered middle class. But that's only a difference of 10 percentage points, which, although it is a lot of people, it's not too striking a difference. Next, I wanted to discuss how middle-class workers are faring in the labor market, in particular in light of the current recession that they're dealing with, but also thinking about longer-term trends. So as you know, of course, the unemployment rate in California is at an historic high since the Great Depression, at nearly 12% in 2011. When we look at this picture among just middle-class families, we find that from the middle of the middle class and in the upper part of the middle class, actually workers are doing a little bit better. So the unemployment rate among upper middle class families is a lot lower than it is in California overall. And you can actually see in the past couple of years a turnaround where it looks like the trend is reversing and the unemployment rate is declining. However, if you look at lower middle class families, the unemployment rate is actually higher than the California average, and we don't see any sign of a turnaround as of 2011. It appears the unemployment rate is still increasing, and we're not sure when that will turn around. In addition to this unemployment rate issue, of course, you probably already know, but the time spent looking for work among the unemployed people in California is higher than it's ever been since we've been tracking that kind of data. On average in the state, an unemployed person has been looking for work about 37 weeks by 2011, and that's about the same average if we look just at middle class families. Upper middle class families tend to do a little bit better. They are on average looking for work for 29 weeks by 2011. I find in this work that even for middle class workers who managed to stay employed during the recession, their earnings have taken a hit. And in this chart, I'm separating out different groups of middle class workers, the lower middle class from the upper middle class, and then the middle. You can see in the first set of columns that median earnings, even for families who were still working, were headed by somebody working during the recession, their earnings took a hit. So about a 3 to 4% decline in earnings during the recession compared to the 2 years before. And this, I find, is due to the fact that they tend to be underemployed. They're less likely to be working full-time, and they are working on average fewer hours during the recession. And the declines are particularly stark for the lower middle-class workers. We see in the last set of columns, actually, the wages on average of middle-class workers who were employed during the recession increased slightly. And this is very different from previous recessions, where wages took a hit as well. What's unique about this recession is that inflation is near zero. So employers in past recessions have been able to kind of adjust their labor costs by just keeping the nominal wage the same and allowing inflation to kind of eat away at that cost. In this recession, because we have virtually no inflation, employers can't adjust that way. So instead of just allowing wages to fall in real terms, they have been laying off or having people work fewer hours. In the year of recovery, so from 2009 to 2010, we see some signs of a turnaround on these underemployment measures for the middle class. You can see that earnings have picked back up for the middle and upper middle class, while the lower middle class still hasn't seen a turnaround in their median earnings. But one indicator that is good across all groups is that there appears to be a growth in the rate of full-time employment during the recession, during the year of recovery. But average hours worked has not yet turned around. So there are still challenges, even for middle-class workers who've managed to stay employed during the recession. Looking forward, we do not yet know when income will turn around, and we don't know how the recovery will be shared across the distribution. If past patterns repeat themselves, we can expect that high incomes will likely recover much faster than low incomes and middle incomes. And this can exacerbate the already growing inequality between high and low incomes in the state, as well as the shrinking middle class. So policy has a kind of dual set of roles to play. First, in the short term, addressing how the recovery will be shared across the middle class and across the distribution broadly, as well as in the long term, promoting opportunity across income distribution, across different classes, so that families don't get left behind. And I'll be discussing those implications a bit more in the next part.
Excuse me.
Thank you.
Sarah, just one question. One of the things I know in a book called The Two-Income Trap, and their research, two Harvard professors, if memory serves me, a mom and her daughter years ago, focused on purchasing power. So your statistics are largely driven by wages. Is that correct?
That's right.
So have you done anything about purchasing power? Because as memory serves me, maybe this is for other panelists, that's one of the real concerns, is even though wages have gone up, purchasing power, in particular, disposable income, has gone down.
I
Or
haven't
discretionary income, I should say.
I haven't looked at that specifically. I know today the California Budget Project had data out that looked more at disposable income, I think. But even if you look at total income before taxes, and you see declines from the median and below. So certainly their purchasing power has not kept up, and it's the upper income levels that have really seen those gains.
So if memory serves me, the statistic is that for American households, there are 5 fixed costs, and if I can remember them: healthcare, transportation, education, taxes, and I'm missing the 5th one.
Housing.
Housing, yes, thank you, very good. So that there was a time, and again, this is just my memory, and as I get older, it's failing. And this actually comes from the restaurant, being a restaurant owner, you'd follow trade journals, and they'd keep talking about that, is that for a restaurant owner, of course, you're dependent, or any retail, to some degree in restaurant business, very largely on discretionary income. It's one of the first things there's a saying in the restaurant business, where the first one's in and the first one's out for economic turnaround, because it's an indication of whether people feel free enough to spend beyond their fixed household costs. So housing costs, even now, it's interesting, and we're going to try to do some hearings in my role as chair of the Transportation Housing Committee about the cost of housing. So although housing costs in some ways have come down because of the recession in the housing, we're seeing that rental home ownership is more affordable if you have the money, but rental costs are going up. So the impact of all of these things on people's discretionary income, and I forgot who recently wrote about just defining freedom, and freedom to some degree is defined on what your discretionary income is. So you take your vacation, you go to the movies, and you may pay more or less for where you live and how far you travel and the education that you provide for your children. But when that keeps shrinking, and it has such an effect on turnover in the income, and also the fact that middle-income people tend to spend their money in America, even though we've tried to get us all to save more money, but so that's good for the economy in the sense of it keeps it going and there's turnover.
One comment I would make is that a critique of our method, which uses the federal poverty level of income to define a consistent level of well-being, that statistic doesn't maybe capture a lot of those, especially across different places, how the cost of housing and other of those areas of spending that you mentioned vary. We don't fully capture what it means to be middle class in California relative to other areas. And I know the Census Bureau is developing an alternative measure of that, which we can use in the future to provide maybe a broader picture than we're able to at this point.
Well, it'd be interesting to watch your career go forward and have the numbers change. I appreciate that. And again, since there's just the small group here, hopefully we can be fairly informal about exchanging opinions as we go through this. Our next presenter, Aaron Currier, and I do want to thank all of you for being here. I know this is no small commitment to come and spend a good portion of your afternoon with us, but I really appreciate it. So Aaron Currier, we're very pleased to have with us. She's from the Pew Charitable Trust, who do just great work for all Americans, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here to talk with you today about a topic that's been in the news quite a bit lately, which is whether or not the American dream is actually alive and well, and how Americans are moving up and down the income distribution over their lifetimes and across generations. Our project at Pew, the Economic Mobility Project, believes that understanding how these movements happen on the income ladder is critical for understanding whether or not we are promoting equality of opportunity and whether the American dream is attainable for everyone. So over the next few minutes, my comments are going to focus in particular on a report that we released a few months ago that investigates the middle class and their ability to stay in the middle class over a generation. And then later I'll talk a little bit about the policy implications that we feel have come out of our work. There are two main ways that we measure economic mobility in the United States, and the first is absolute. This is a measure of income change over time adjusted for inflation. And when we look at absolute mobility in the United States, we see a pretty positive picture, because over the last generation, the vast majority of families, 2/3, actually have exceeded the family income of their parents. And that's true across the income distribution. Typically in our analyses, we divide the full income distribution into 5 equal pieces, which you can kind of think of as rungs on a ladder. And we know that even at that bottom rung, 82% of families have higher family income than their parents did at the same age. So that's really a great reason to be positive. The important caveat, though, is that it's not a very high bar to exceed your parents' income when you're at that level. And we also know that gains in absolute mobility have not been shared equally across the income distribution, and that percent change in income has been much higher at the middle and the top than it has been at the bottom. The second way that we measure mobility is a relative measure, and this looks at where people fall on the income distribution as a whole, regardless of how much income they have. If you think about it across generations, I like to say that it's a measure of how far the apple falls from the tree. If you were raised by a family at the bottom, how likely are you to also be at the bottom? Or if you were raised in the middle, how likely is it that you will stay in the middle? The relative mobility numbers are sort of a glass half empty, because we see a lot of what we call stickiness at the ends. People who were raised in the bottom are highly likely to stay in the bottom themselves. 42% of those who started in the bottom fifth remain in the bottom fifth. And another 23% only make it to that second rung of the income ladder. The same is true when you look at the top of the income distribution. 39% who are raised in the top fifth remain in the top fifth, and another 23% fall to the fourth rung. So when they do fall, they don't fall far. That stickiness suggests that even as families are experiencing economic growth and income gains over a generation, those gains may be incremental and such that it's not enough to move them out of the position that they are on the income ladder as a whole. So particularly in terms of a relative mobility measure, we know that equality of opportunity is not necessarily happening in the way that we as a nation would like to see it, in the way that Americans would like to see it happening. Our project has commissioned 2 public opinion polls, one in 2009 and one just a few months ago, to better understand how Americans define the American dream, their perceptions of economic mobility, and what they think matters for people moving up the income ladder. And what this chart shows is that Americans are not necessarily interested in being rich or even in being middle class. Those are the 2 least popular definitions of the American dream given. Instead, they want economic security. They talk about having a home, having a post-secondary education, and really critical to their definition of the American dream is their children being better off than them. Keeping that definition in mind, your children exceeding your status on the income ladder, we conducted some research and released it in September on how likely it was that people who were raised in the middle class would stay in the middle class over a generation. As Sarah mentioned, there really is no sort of universally accepted definition of the middle class. So we also took a metric based on the poverty rate. We define the middle as anyone falling between the 30th percentile and the 70th percentile of the income distribution. And we took that number because the income associated with the 30th percentile for a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, is reflective of amount of income where you would no longer qualify for public assistance from the government. And that, to us, meant that people just above and just below that line could have qualitatively different levels of economic security. This figure shows the income cutoffs for the 30th and 70th percentile in both the parent generation and the child generation. The numbers are very hard to see. I can see that. So for the parent generation, it translates to $32,900 to about $64,000. And in the child generation, which are adults today, it translates to about $54,000 to $110,000. I think this chart does a good job of showing the results of absolute mobility growth. You can see the way that the middle class definition changes in just one generation. The income distribution is getting wider, and where the middle class falls is rising. What we did for this report was take people who were teenagers in 1979 and look at them when they were between 39 and 44 years old. So we knew that they were raised in the middle class in the late 70s, and we want to know what happens to them now today. We looked at downward mobility in 3 different ways. And the first was a very simple measure: how many people just fall below that 30th percentile. And we found that 28% do, almost a third. We also wanted to capture people who experienced a significant amount of downward mobility, even if they were still within our definition of middle class. So if they fell 20 percentiles or more from where their parents were. So as an example, if their parents were at the 70th percentile and they fell to the 50th, that's a pretty substantive drop in our opinion, although they're still solidly within our definition of middle class. So we thought the second measure was important. Again, by that measure, 28% of people experienced a drop of at least 20 percentiles from their parents' rank. The third measure we looked at was an absolute one, and we found that 19% of Americans have at least 20% or less income, a 20% reduction in their income, at least from where their parents were. So the next question we asked was why? What's causing people to fall out of the middle? What factors are really impactful for people remaining in the middle class? And what differences do we see? And what we found was that personal characteristics, family background, and personal choices do make a difference for who stays in the middle class and who falls. In particular, we found that post-secondary education is very critical. Women with a college degree, a 4-year college degree, are 16 percentage points less likely to fall out of the middle than women who have a high school diploma or less. For men, just having some college matters. Men who have some post-secondary classes, even if they don't have a degree, are 13 percentage points less likely to fall out of the middle than men who only have a high school diploma or less. And in a related finding, we discovered that the scores on the Armed Forces Qualification Test, which is a standardized test that the U.S. military administers for eligibility in the armed forces, and was a test that all of the teenagers in this survey that we used took, also determines largely how people stay, where they fall in the income distribution. And those who had higher percentile scores on that standardized test were more likely to stay in the middle class than those who had lower scores. The next factor that we identified as being important for your middle class status is whether or not you're married. In particular, this is important for women. Women who are married are 36 percentage points less likely to fall out of the middle than women who are widowed, divorced, or separated. Men were 13 percentage points more likely to stay in the middle if they were married. Those who were single were also more likely to fall out of the middle than those who were married. For women, it was 19 percentage points, and for men, it was 10. Some of the most interesting findings that this report uncovered were about differences in downward mobility by race and gender. Women are more likely than men to fall out of the middle, but this is a phenomenon that's unique to whites. So only white women are more likely to fall than white men. 30% of white women fall out of the middle class compared to 21% of white men. When we looked at black women compared to black men and Hispanic women compared to Hispanic men, their rates of downward mobility out of the middle were almost identical. Black men are almost twice as likely as white men to fall out of the middle class. This was probably the most stark finding from our report. Interestingly, white, black, and Hispanic women are equally likely to experience downward mobility out of the middle. So when you think about women of different races, their likelihood of falling is the same. Similarly, Hispanic men are about equally likely to white men to fall out of the middle. So the differences by race are completely driven by differences between white men and black men. All of our reports, including this one, are available on our website at economicmobility.org. And my comments will focus in the next panel on the policy implications of this research and what we feel like can be done to enhance mobility in the U.S. I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Erin. Our next presenter, Sarah Flux, is a policy coordinator at the California Labor Federation. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, and I just wanted to thank the Senator for convening this select committee on an issue that is very dear to our hearts in the labor movement. And also want to thank the other panelists for being here, especially for doing the numbers piece, because I'm going to talk more about trends than numbers in my presentation, so I don't have a PowerPoint. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the current economic crisis has impacted the middle class, but also about some of the trends in the last decade and how they have really impacted and started to shrink the middle class. Interestingly, at the same time that numbers in unions and union density has declined. So right now, the real impact of the economic crisis, at least in unemployment for the middle class, is that construction has taken a huge hit. So while unemployment right now, I think in November, is 11.7% in California, in some of our trades, it's 40 to 50%. At least 45% in the Central Valley. And these are trained, skilled construction workers that are sitting on the bench, many of them for 2 or more years, who have definitely exhausted their 99 weeks of benefits. So this is a huge issue, and is also a huge issue because it's a highly unionized industry. So the wages are good, the benefits are good, and there's retirement security. But even though this is something we see that there's not an easy solution to kind of end this type of unemployment, the economic crisis has really just accelerated trends that have been happening. Since 2000, California has lost 470,000 manufacturing jobs. That's about 25% of the manufacturing jobs in California. And this is an incredible impact on our economy because manufacturing has a real multiplier effect. So for every manufacturing job, that creates 2.5 jobs in the broader economy, in supply chains, in small businesses. It's a huge impact to lose that many manufacturing jobs. Also, manufacturing was a highly unionized industry. We have much higher average wages in manufacturing than in other industries such as retail. And there was overwhelmingly health benefits and retirement security in the form of pensions. The other thing about manufacturing is that manufacturing used to be a job where you could graduate from high school, you could go into manufacturing, and for the next 30 years, you'd be able to buy a house, raise your kids, have health care, stay in the same community, stay in the same job, and then retire with your pension. It created a stable middle class to have manufacturing jobs. Similarly, something that gets less attention is the public sector, which had the same effect for many women and people of color. Going into the public sector, which is highly unionized in California, allowed for people to be able to graduate from high school, have some college, and be able to buy a house, raise their children, be in the middle class. So these jobs, and I would argue that the high unionization of these jobs, allowed people to enter the middle class and stay there even when they retired. Right now, because of deindustrialization and the fact that even though we invent things here, like the iPhone, the Kindle, we don't make any of it here, including kind of the last vestiges of advanced manufacturing. That is all going now to South Korea, to China, to other parts of Asia, who have the ability to do advanced manufacturing. Even though California pretty much invented the solar industry, 90% of solar is manufactured outside of California, generally abroad. So what's replaced our economy is the service sector. So it's much less union than manufacturing in the public sector. Generally part-time, low wages, high turnover, no benefits, very little retirement security. There's also been a rise in the contingent workforce. So independent contractors, or the misclassification of independent contractors, temp workers, temp agencies, subcontracting, subcontracting. So getting away from any kind of stable employment or central employer. And also the rise of the underground economy. So what you have now is you have people who are graduating from high school who have no job opportunities except for the service sector, who are told, go get an education, get a college degree. People are going to college, whether it's a GED or community college, CSU or UC. They're going through, they end up with insane amounts of debt because of skyrocketing tuition, and they get out and there aren't the same jobs that are available. There are some, but not for the thousands of people, millions of people who could be in our middle class. But they are, instead of being able to get out without any debt, they now have the ball and chain of debt that's dragging them out of the middle class, even if they had a chance of getting into it. So that's a little bit of what young people are looking at. On the other end, we have our retirees who used to be guaranteed a kind of stable retirement, who are now losing a lot of that because of what Jacob Hacker, who's I think a professor at Yale, has called the great risk shift, where that we used to have kind of pooled risk, where employers would provide health care, that they had defined benefit pensions, but now all of that's being shifted onto individual families in the middle class. So instead of having this three-legged stool where you had Social Security, defined benefit pension, and your own private savings, they've taken out the pension piece and the defined benefits, and now you just have a shaky two-legged stool. So where once we were able to eliminate this plague, this epidemic of old age poverty, we now see that that could be coming full circle. And we are facing a generation of people who are not going to have retirement. In fact, in the state of California, 50% of workers do not have any employer-provided retirement security. Nothing. For the rest of them, only 44% take up the retirement. In the private sector, the majority of that is defined contribution, which is much less stable and doesn't guarantee you with all of this market fluctuation. So you have a huge loss of wealth when we have economic crises. And then we have nearly half of California workers face poverty in their old age right now, especially on the younger end, so 25 to 44, because their savings would put them at 200% below the poverty level. And we see attacks on pensions of public sector workers. There's, I think, a bit of pension envy going on, which I understand. I mean, everybody should be able to have a pension to avoid old age poverty, so where you spend all of your life in the middle class and all of a sudden you're dragged out of it because you no longer have the retirement that you thought you had. But instead of looking at how to expand pensions, it's pushing more of that risk onto public employees as well. And so another trend that we've seen that we, at least in California labor, think has contributed to this is the decline of union density in the state. Even though California still has relatively high density compared to the rest of the country, it's really fallen, especially in the private sector where it's about 8%. And we, there's many kind of global trends because of that, the decline of manufacturing, public sector, the growth of the service sector, difficulties in organizing, immigration policy, which is a whole other aspect that I won't get into. But there's also been direct attacks on unions that we've seen in California and across the nation, attacking collective bargaining, attacking pensions, and then also attacking the role of unions in politics. Because beyond just sitting at the negotiating table and bargaining contracts, unions have had an effect on policy and on policies that preserve the middle class and make sure that we keep the floor, the minimum, at a level where people can move up rather than participating in a race to the bottom. And so those attacks have really made it a lot harder for unions to be able to preserve the middle class. So that's really depressing, but we do have some suggestions and recommendations in the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So just, I'm being mindful that we're talking about a snapshot of California's middle class, so the idea was to sort of frame this. So we'll appreciate Sarah's comments, but we're really pleased to have Scott Hogue, who's the founder and president of Small Business California here. So the idea was to have a balanced discussion about this, and I appreciate Scott's work. We've worked together on a number of things. And when we get through, Scott, maybe just a very informal discussion about the sort of framing and the snapshot of the middle class in the United States. And I'd particularly like to just think about the purchasing power aspect of it, and also the demographics of the middle class, because we are told over and over again the demographics, particularly of the baby boom generation, Sarah hit on this a little bit, is driving so much in this country. And then just the global economy, I think, has a lot to do with this. So when we talk about manufacturing, we've had a lot of discussion in Sacramento about there's somewhat of an attitude of you can't have manufacturing in a high-cost economy like California, but then we look at places like Germany, and particularly southern Germany or Japan, where they have high cost, but they've still been able to continue to have very vibrant manufacturing sectors. So maybe just that is sort of think about as we go to Scott and finish up our presentations on this panel, come back, have a little discussion about the snapshot, and then we'll go to the second part is how can we, what kind of solutions can we come up with? Scott.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the opportunity to have the small business perspective in this panel. And I would have expected that, having you being a small business owner in the past, you're sensitive to it, so we appreciate that. What I'd like to do is kind of briefly outline the impact of small business in the economy. On a national basis, there are about 27.3 million small businesses, of which that includes sole proprietors with no employees. Probably about 2/3 of them are sole proprietors with no employees. And we employ approximately 50% of the workforce, private workforce in the United States. That definition comes from the Small Business Administration, and they use a definition of small business of 500 employees. Coming to California, and nationally also, we create, and over the last many years, we create 2/3 of the new jobs, net new jobs that occur in this country. In California, I use a little different definition, and I think California, for the most part, uses a little different definition. It's 100 employees is the general definition. And there are somewhere between 3.2 and 3.5 million small businesses. Again, about 2/3 are sole proprietors with no employees. We also do about 2/3 of the net new jobs. And most of the people working in small business, and I don't have any actual numbers here, but I would venture to guess that not only most of the employees that are working, full-time employees, would be in the middle class definition, as well as the owners of the business. It's a misconception that business owners are making massive amounts of profit, and there are some, but small businesses, especially right now, are really struggling. One of the interesting things that has occurred in this last downturn is that traditionally, when you look at minor drops in the economy or recessions, what you'll see is small businesses tend to hang on to their employees, because they're family to us. It's a lot harder to release an employee from a small business. And by the way, I am a small business owner. I have 28 employees. So I know firsthand the impact. And aside, I had an employee that died of a heart attack 3 weeks ago. And I will tell you, it just stung much more than just an employee. It was a family member, and that's the way people think of within the agency. So normally we tend to hold on to employees a little longer than larger companies, and I'll cite in San Francisco during the downturn, the dot-com boom, we, using 100 employees, 54% of the private sector employment in San Francisco was through small businesses. However, in the downturn of 2002, we only were responsible for 23% of the reduced employment, even though we had 54%. That traditionally has been the way it works. This last downturn was much more severe and much deeper, that small businesses were laying off employees much more so than larger companies, and that's kind of unique. It was kind of a desperation move for a lot of small businesses. Over the last, you look at the numbers over the last few years, and again, I've looked at a number of studies here, and you'll get some differing numbers, but the profit levels for small business, River City Bank did a survey. They found that in their customers, profits were down for small businesses 80%. So it's pretty dramatic. And again, that all has a bearing on employment and ability to provide benefits and a host of other things. The issues for small business, obviously, I think you have to have a vibrant small business community because we create the jobs. And if this economy is going to turn around, small businesses has got to be leading the way. But it's very, very difficult right now. The whole area of healthcare that you mentioned is kind of a fixed cost. Most small businesses want to provide health insurance for their employees. The problem is they just can't afford it. And the difficulty where they are providing it, they're looking at double-digit increases every year for the last 7 or 8 years. My company, except this year we didn't see it, but my company had an average of 14% increase over the last 7 years until this year. So what happens, and this is where it comes down to the employees, you've got to try to find ways to, if you're not increasing your revenues given the economy, you've got to find ways to cover that cost. And what unfortunately small businesses want to hold on to their health insurance, but they look at the economic realities. They go out and shop, they go out and look at different deductibles, they go out and look at different co-payments, and obviously that's going to pass down to the employee. And the last thing they look at is passing on some of that increased cost. So where they may be paying 100% this year, they look at 70%. You can go down to 50%. Obviously, that's money coming out of the pockets of the individual employee. While their salary may be the same, they're having thousands of dollars taken out because they've got to cover the health care cost where the employee is or employer is providing health insurance. And then the last area, and it hasn't happened exceedingly quickly, although it's a continued deterioration, that it reaches a point that an employer just says, I can't afford to have health insurance. That's the last straw. The other real quick problem in that can be depending on what the age of their workforce is. If they have a workforce that is what I call the immortals, under 30, maybe 35 that are single, and you start trying to pass on cost for health insurance to them, you get a kickback, and they resist because they don't think they need it. So where you think you're providing a benefit and you ask them to pick up 10, 20, 30%, they resent that. So an employer is put in this awkward position of what do? You want to keep your employees happy, but they're not happy when if you're going to be passing on costs to them. So that's the whole healthcare issue has been a big issue. It's been the #1 issue 7 years in a row in our surveys for small business. The other piece of it is, I mentioned 2/3 of the employees are sole employers or sole proprietors. They're subject to the same problems in the healthcare market as the individual market because they don't have 2 employees. The current health program is 2 to 50 employees. They're 1. So they're faced with all the problems of underwriting that you're going to face, and that is a big issue for a lot of the sole proprietors out there that might have relatively, in my mind, minor health problems. We've heard like asthma, that they can't get health insurance or it's exorbitantly expensive. So that's a big area of concern. The other problem, and I'm not listing them so much in priorities because another problem that came out at #2 in our survey came out an educated workforce and what they were seeing in people that are coming to them for employment. And there's a feeling, and with some validity, that some of the people that they're seeing don't have the basic skills. I have somebody that has a hardware store, and his test of a new employee is how many inches in a foot, how many feet in a yard, and if something costs $1 and it's a 10% discount, how much is it going to cost? And surprisingly, he's having trouble finding people in that area. So that's number 2. Number 3 was infrastructure, which I won't go into. Number 4, though, is no surprise. Number 4 is access to capital. Right. And that is a major problem right now. What has happened is small business, I mentioned profitability is down. One of the things the banks are looking for is profitability. The second thing, the other thing they're going to look at is the credit. What's their credit rating? And because of the problems, their credit ratings are beginning to, interestingly enough, the credit rating may be going down, but by the same token, because of the regulatory climate in the United States, and in some cases California also, the regulatory climate is requiring more when the numbers are actually going down, which creates a real problem. And then in some cases, they're seeing their credit lines pulled or their loans pulled because their other collateral, their homes, have all gone down because of the downturn in the economy. And what interesting, what happens there is you get your line of credit pulled or you get your loan pulled, and then your credit score gets worse. So it's a horrible cycle that occurs, and that's, I'll get into some suggested recommendations for the future, but the whole aspect of credit is a major problem. The other area that we hear frequently is regulatory, and it is a problem on a local, state, and national basis. It costs significantly more for small businesses to handle the regulatory issues. And again, I'm not one, and we don't come from the point that regulations aren't necessary. They are necessary in some case, but when regulations are made, what needs to be done is to find the most efficient way of implementing the recommendations and find mediation programs that will reduce the cost of the businesses. There obviously are some regulations that are just crazy, but the regulatory issue on a national basis, the cost for a small business to comply, firms with under 20, and this is coming from the Small Business Administration, firms with under 20 employees, the cost to comply is $10,585 per employee. The cost to comply, these are full-time, the cost to comply is for businesses with 500 or more employees is $7,755. And that's just federal. The state would reflect, I don't know what the absolute, California's never done anything like this, but California would reflect a disproportionate amount for smaller businesses because we don't have the economies of scale. Taking the human resource area, we don't have human resource managers because we don't have enough employees that we can justify the cost of a human resource manager. So regulatory issues become a big issue for a lot of businesses. Issues that come and go that are out there, it depends on what the cycle is. The cost of workers' compensation was a big deal in 2003, 2004. It was actually the #1 issue. It's dropped down to number 8. But we're seeing a situation in the future. One of the concerns is that workers' compensation, we're fearing at some point in the near future, is going to go up pretty dramatically. That will rise back up. When you look at the combined loss ratios for the insurance companies, they're up in the high 120s right now, which would tend to indicate, and you've got a very competitive market, that could rear itself as a problem. The other aspect is energy cost. And depending on where the cost of a gallon of gas is going to determine where that's going to be in the whole scheme of things. But for some businesses, that's a big issue if you're tied into not just your own costs, but if you've got suppliers that have large energy costs. Obviously, that gets passed on. Taxation is an issue. One of the things that really drives me crazy, though, is taxation is an issue. I don't, and tax credits and those kind of things, I think those are important, but I think it's more important to address the issue of access to capital. If you don't have capital, it really doesn't matter if you've got a tax break or whatever, because you can't you can't raise the capital to hire people or to bring on new equipment. So I think that's really a much, much more important. But you'll always hear taxation as a big issue, and it does have some importance. Those are kind of the issues. Again, I stress from a small business perspective. One of the other things that frustrates us a little bit is there's a misconception on the part of a lot of people on what profit levels are for business owners. And I traditionally go out and I ask people, and I ask kids, I do a lot of teaching. If somebody makes $1 in a small business, or charges $1, what's their profit level? And the normal response they get is 25%. So there's a lack of understanding out there. 25%. I took 2 kids out, and I asked them this question, and they both said 25%. And I took them out to a candy factory, and I said to the owner, I said, "What's your profit level?" And he says, "I do really good. I get 4%. He's gets 2." But that misconception is important out there of an understanding that when policy is being made or things are happening, they tend to be made in the reflection of larger companies where there's higher profit levels, and not the smaller businesses that aren't seeing those kind of profit levels.
That stimulates a bunch of questions. But just briefly, and please feel free to jump in, I wanted to, as I mentioned, and since we have a fairly diverse group up here when it comes to gender and age, I would suggest I was going to try to focus on just a few questions. Again, we're trying to define the problem. Is there a diminishing middle class? And of course, the first presentation brings into question whether that's true, how much it is affected. I'm always reminded when I do town halls, I usually start, if I have a PowerPoint, the first few pages talking about what's right with California, and it always sort of astounds people. I did one yesterday to the Contra Costa Council, which is our large countywide business group, and afterwards quite a few people came up and said, well, the sky isn't falling as much as I thought it was, because you talk about the fact that we're still the 8th largest economy with $2 trillion in gross domestic product, that I found out yesterday that now 50% of the venture capital in the United States comes to California. There's an enormous amount of patents from small businesses still being generated. So I think your comments sort of went to that, the PPIC poll, that there's still, but all of this, I think, is in context, in my lifetime at least, of huge sociological changes. So I mentioned the 2-income trap, and that brought a lot of discussion, I think, that people have continued to pursue, and your findings about particularly women falling out of middle income. So in their research, memory serves me, that it would take two incomes to earn 75% of what one income earned in the greatest generation. So if we just took my parents' generation, the World War II generation, to the baby boomers, we had this great influx in California, led the world, and the United States led the world as a nation in having women in the workforce, which are tremendous sociological and cultural benefits from that. But who got the economic benefits from it? And at least in the 2-income trap, in their research, it begs the question that you had to have 2 incomes to maintain the level. And then particularly if the woman were to get divorced or didn't get an undergraduate degree, graduate degree, their lack of sort of reverse mobility. So any of you have any comments about just the sociological changes? And of course that relates to the global economy at the same time where our social model was changing dramatically within a generation, really. Then we had globalism, and part of this effect is that often used John Kennedy quote that a rising tide will rise all boats. Well, we certainly see in China right now, and we fret about the competitiveness with American workforce with China, and Sarah mentioned this. How do you produce a solar panel in? Well, we see this right now in the Bay Area with the crisis down at I'm spacing on the Saldana, is how do you manufacture things here when the cost of manufacturing it and the transportation costs are still so much smaller than having it here. So my general question, and maybe I'd ask Sarah, since you in your research, and then Aaron, particularly about the sociological changes, the general feel that I get, at least, and this is anecdotal, but also reading a lot, and if you read Joseph Stiglitz's comments about a strong middle class, and as much of a curmudgeon as he can be, he points to things that we could do to stimulate spending in the middle class. The sociological changes strike me as being particularly painful, because if you're under pressure and if you don't have access to capital, whether you're a small business owner or you're trying to keep your house, that's one thing. But when two people are working as hard as they can, they can't catch up. So sort of the cumulative effect. So I know this is somewhat rambling, but I just sense, and this is a good indication that we didn't try to direct this presentation too much, that there's a lot more angst as we sit a block and a half away from where Occupy Oakland was. I don't know if they're still there, remnants of it. There's a lot more pressure on middle-income people, at least anecdotally, than we get out of some of the numbers tell us. You have any comments?
Well, as an economist, I can't comment too much on the sociological aspect of things, although I think it's very important. Certainly the long-term trend in the labor market was towards increased female labor market participation, and that had the effect of increasing family earnings for a bit. But then I think it hits up against other economic trends, like you mentioned, globalization and technological progress, which has tended to hollow out the middle type of jobs where these two-earner families, maybe both of them were working in those good middle-class jobs, and those are disappearing. So I think it's the demographic component of changes over the last 3 or 4 decades has really kind of been a perfect storm, maybe, with the broader economic trends. In terms of, I wanted to comment on middle class spending and the idea that it's middle class that drives the economy. I've read a lot of Robert Reich's work on this, and I'm quite sure he's correct on the numbers. But if you really want to think about how the middle class is doing, you need to consider the savings rate as well. And I think recently I've seen some evidence that the savings rate has gone down again, and that's clearly not sustainable. So really, to encourage consumption as a driver of our economy, we need to create the jobs of the future and train workers for those jobs. Both the two earners of the family, both of them, retrain them or train the young workers for the jobs of the future, so that it can really come out of income. Consumption can come out of income and not out of going further into debt.
And that's interesting. There was a New York Times did an article in the last 6 months about one of the ways to get our economy going is to get Chinese workers to stop saving as much as they are. Did you see that?
I didn't see that.
No, it was just interesting. Cultural norms. Aaron, about particularly the gender issues, do you have any? Did you research any further about why women might be more vulnerable to falling out?
Well, I think the data is pretty clear that women still earn a significantly lower wage than men. And so when they lose that second earner, they can be losing a significant portion of their family income. It's interesting, we have data when we compare fathers and sons' earnings. We know that over the last generation, sons actually earn 12% less than their fathers did at the same age. But when you look at family income and you account for women's entrance into the labor force, we see a 12% increase in family income over the last generation. So we know that having that second earner really matters. To your second question about sort of how people are feeling and the instability of the middle class, I unfortunately don't have the data yet, but one of the research projects that we're working on over the next year is going to investigate specifically how neighborhood poverty has been impacted by the recession. And we suspect that the results may be a bit counterintuitive. On the one hand, we know that families at the bottom of the income ladder have taken a really big hit in a lot of ways, but they also tend to be renters. In some cases, they may be eligible for housing subsidies and other supports from the government that were in place during the recession, whereas middle-class families who often own their homes may now be underwater on their homes. They may be stuck where they are and limiting their geographic mobility, so they might not be able to sell their home in order to move to get a new job. So it's very possible that, in fact, the middle class was hit harder in the current recession than people at the bottom of the income ladder. And we look forward to sharing those data when we have them, but I think the picture is more complex than it might look on its face.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, so much of what you said, because of my own personal experience, resonates with me. But one of the things that I find, still doing consulting and having some young people who are trying to keep a business open in San Francisco, it's the cumulative effect of all this stuff. So you mentioned regulatory, and we deal with that a lot in politics. If we just had less regulatory of an atmosphere in California, we would have a more vibrant business climate, which I agree with in the cumulative, because as I talk to young people who look at me for advice to keep their restaurant open, it's just it's changed so much, and it's not, and it's something I think Governor Brown has been good at. It when people criticize, he will say, "Well, give me specifics." And one of the things I find in trying to give specifics is it's not that easy. As you mentioned, it's much more complex. But the particular thing I think, and this is true for small business, but it's true for middle income people as well, is that the crush is that you can't pass on your costs of business. So your healthcare costs go up at the same time that people have less disposable income. So for instance, when I owned a restaurant in Concord for 30 years, very middle income community, great community. But if gas prices went up, all my purveyors would immediately raise to cover their costs and a little bit more. Well, I couldn't pass that on because my customers were dealing with the negative impacts as well. And then all of that struck together is just so hard. So we're trying to get through this recession, and I know I hear this from lots of small business people. When they would go through downturns, they would be, well, we're just going to try to get by so that we can get to where people start having money again. So I think you really illustrated, if healthcare costs go up, there's no place to go to pass those along.
Yeah, there's
in an
also,
economy that's flat.
There's also a, just what people think and the optimism.
Mm-hmm.
The small businesses by nature are optimistic. You got to be in order to run your own business. And if you're going to be thinking of hiring people or adding equipment, you got to be optimistic. Mm-hmm. We need to do something about the optimism. That's a real problem. When I did my survey, and this may not sound like a large number, but I was really surprised. We asked, do you see yourself in business in 3 years? 21% said they didn't see themselves in business. I think, now obviously some of them are going to retire, but the majority of people were not going to retire in 3 years. I think that's a scary number. Here's the optimistic small business, and 21% don't see themselves in business in 3 years. Going to your comments about regulations, the other aspect there is not even the regulation or what they're trying to accomplish, but the bureaucracy that you've got to go through to meet it. So let's say I want to take out a permit. I may have to deal with anywhere from 5 to 10 agencies to take out that permit. And those agencies may have different standards, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to navigate that regulatory process. And the problem you've got in a lot of agencies is there's turf battles, and they don't want to give their authority to somebody else, so you run into this incredible bureaucracy, and not even that you don't want to do it, you don't know how to do it. And you've got to deal with multiple, and that just runs up the cost. The other aspect about passing on the cost, or especially if you get to a situation where they drop their insurance or they don't have insurance, I'm a firm believer that if somebody has health insurance, that they're probably going to be a better employee because they don't have to, unless they're the immortals, because they don't care. But if I've got a couple of kids and a family and I don't have any insurance, I'm going to be worried about what happens if I get sick, what happens if my children get sick. That's going to take time away from my business. You don't have the focus. So from a business standpoint, it's not good policy if you can afford it not to provide health insurance.
I feel more like a talk show host than a chair of a committee here, but I wanted to ask Sarah a question. So all those folks who are on the bench, as you said, I've heard stories about electricians, whether they were union electricians or non-union, that was a pretty good job for a young person who didn't have a bachelor's degree getting out. And the probability of continued employment, people just assumed that, again, we had a program I know in Richmond. I think Senator Hancock actually started it, where there's an academy over there that works with the local, with the building trades in Contra Costa County. And it's a great program. It is a great program when it comes to confidence, because there you had a very low-performing district school, lots of people, mostly of color, and just the fact that 25 kids were in that school who were getting apprenticeship credits and being trained in a craft, they were going to get their high school degree, and most likely a lot of those kids are going to go off to Chevron and work in the refinery and make $65,000 a year. So what happens to those people who are on the bench for 2 years in skilled trades? Where do they go when they can't get a job?
Well, that's one of the problems that the trades are facing, is that people don't have anywhere to go. I mean, they're losing their homes, they're trying to find work, they're trying to get retrained. But the problem with retraining is if there's no jobs to be retrained into, there's a mismatch. And so one of the things that we want to start pushing on, and our executive council is coming up with a jobs plan for 2012 that we want to move, hopefully, through the legislature. And part of that is aligning our job training programs and the Workforce Investment Act money with jobs of the future. So not necessarily the jobs that are here now, but where do we see lots of growth? High-speed rail, if it ever gets built, what are the needs that we have? We're going to need massive amounts of electricians on that project. So do we have the ones that are trained in the right areas? Healthcare, this goes actually to the small business. There's going to be such a huge change in healthcare with the individual mandate and with the shop exchange and small businesses being able to get tax credits and subsidies, and there'll be a huge explosion in healthcare and in terms of the needs of training people in healthcare. And creating career ladders. So, so much of what's going to be happening in healthcare is that it's going to be pushed out into clinics and home-based care. So we're going to need more training. So having the state think about where is there really going to be job growth and what can we do policy-wise to promote that growth, and then really closely aligning our training with it. Because it's, a lot of the training programs now that we've heard about, you go in and you get a lot of soft skills. So you learn how to dress, and you learn how to write a resume, and you learn how to show up on time. We have guys who've been in the trades for 30 years. They don't really need soft skills. I mean, maybe a little bit, but
either that or it's not,
yeah.
You're not going to be able to give it to them.
Yeah, they're not going to be selling clothing at Nordstrom's. We need to figure out where we're going to put people and what are the skills that they need and how to align that. So that's kind of something that we're thinking about with our workforce and economic development people, is how are we making sure that the money is really training people and then placing them. And we love the idea of career technical education. We have a lot of pre-apprenticeship programs, and just think it's great to have people have on-the-job training and that skills training and be placed in jobs right away. So we'd like to see more of that in, let's see it in nursing, let's see it in healthcare, let's see it in some of the other areas. And this goes back to what Scott was saying too. We need investment in K through 12. We need people who know math and science, and computer literacy should be basic literacy of the 20th century. I mean, it's just like you read and write. Everyone should be able to use a computer these days. So.
Yeah, we're really on the same track as far as we should be training for the jobs that are out there. I think that's really critical. The other thing, this is my personal opinion, is I think we need to get away from the only way you can get a good job is college education. I think we've got to recognize there are going to be a lot of opportunities in the trades, I think, auto repair, other jobs where they can pay a good salary. They don't have to have a college education, but they do need that job training.
All of this, one of the really struggling, and this is probably a good segue to go to the second presentation, is once you, and you mentioned it, consumer confidence, and we just saw it last week as we had and whether consumerism in the middle class drives the economy or not is another cultural problem we have, or it's a challenge at least. So if people go out and spend money, and this goes to, Sarah, we talked about some of your private union affiliates, but we didn't follow that. I was be interested in hearing this as well. As for the public sector unions, I know coming from the private sector, sometimes explaining to the people in the public sector, if we don't have people working, whether they're unionized or not, and the economy growing, we don't have sales tax and assessed value, and then we don't have as much to spend on the private sector, public sector. But then we have more demands on public services. People need unemployment insurance, they need job training, which goes back to education. So we hear over and over again that the only way to really get the economy going and America changing in a world that's changed, and the statistic I remember, it's gotten more so in the last 10 years, but when I graduated from high school, your expectation was, in those days for a male, to have one career with one employer. Now a high school graduate, I think, can expect to have 6 to 8 different careers, much less different employers within that. And that actually, I've read where that's a benefit to California, because if you're not stuck in your home and underwater, at least we're used to mobility in California economically, so we'll go to different places. Which just brings me to sort of a general question, and I'll go to the economist. If you've got that challenge of you need people to consume to continue to drive the economy, or at least pull us out of that, but you also need a balance of saving, which we've been warned about for years, and now we're starting to pay for it. And now, of course, we don't have access to credit, so this is probably a good segue, but maybe that's what we'll do is I'll pose that as a question. Maybe you can answer it in your presentation to a degree. How do you get, if we're so dependent on a consumer economy, and I'm reminded, not being far from being having a doctorate degree in economics, but my memory of Adam Smith is there's 3 phases of economic development: survival, shelter, and then vanity. And one could argue that we've been in the vanity for quite a while. So how do you deal with that as an economist? This is your chance to win the Nobel Prize.
I'm
here,
channeling
right?
Adam Smith. I'm trying to...
Don't channel him. Channel Krugman or Stiglitz.
It's a tough situation, and things. I think a lot of the policy, and I was going to discuss this.
Okay, let's just go
Maybe
to
I'll
the
just-
second. Yeah, we can start. I'm sort of enjoying being a talk show host here, so I'll stop. We'll go to the second part of the panel.
So in the short run and long run, I think policy, to address some of the concerns that you just raised, is largely under the control of federal policymakers, which is a challenge for California in how to address it. And in particular, I think of unemployment insurance benefit extensions, which aren't a permanent policy solution, but can help at least hold up incomes and thus hold up consumption as a driver of the economy for the short term until the recovery really takes off. But that's under federal control, right? And other federal policies like the payroll tax or giant infrastructure investment programs, which can create jobs and well-paying jobs. Bigger policy issues like pro-growth regulation policy and trade policy, even immigration policy, to the extent that it contributes to growth in the labor force and the economy through entrepreneurship. All of those things are up to federal policymakers. And I think, but yet California has the largest jobs gap in the nation at about 2 million workers in order to get us back to pre-recession levels and absorb the new people entering the labor market. So clearly, we want to do something here to just support incomes in the short term and create more jobs and the jobs of the future as well. PPIC this last year released a report by David Newmark, another economist at UC Irvine, addressing how can California policy help create jobs. And I wasn't involved in conducting that research, but I can summarize. His suggestion is that hiring credits are probably the most likely efficient method and cost-effective method in the short run for doing that. The cost, he roughly estimated the cost of per job created would be about between $9,000 and $75,000, which is quite a wide range. These are really hard to estimate. But if you use that figure, if California policy invested $1 billion in hiring credits, that would create about 110,000 jobs, which is a tiny fraction of that 2 million jobs that we need to close. It would adjust the unemployment rate by just less than 0.1%. So really, I think, and we at PPIC and some of our other work on the economy largely would suggest that it's really about getting the economy growing generally. So it's I feel like I don't have maybe the specific recommendations that are needed, but in broad, broad policy, I'll echo what the other panelists have mentioned about just making California an attractive place to do business by, potentially by regulatory reform, corporate tax reform. We rank low on a lot of business climate measures, but we rank high on others because we're kind of a high cost and high benefit state of doing business. So that needs to be taken into account. But to the extent that policy can make a better business climate, that could lead to higher growth and promote the recovery that we need in the short term. I would suggest that long-term policy for economic growth in the state is really about creating a skilled workforce, both retraining workers and creating incentives for education for younger workers. And I'll get back to that in a minute, but I wanted to also highlight just in the short term, workers, especially middle-class workers who've been displaced in the current recession. There's evidence from broader research literature over past recessions, as well as the current recession, that even after displaced workers find a new job, they experience a lot lower earnings over their lifetime at the rate of up to 20–25% lower. And this could translate, one estimate that I use as a ballpark is, on average, a displaced worker earns over their lifetime $112,000 less than had they not been displaced from the labor market. And that's, after they found another job. So in California, if you just roughly calculate how many people have lost their job and each on average losing about $100,000, that's over $200 billion of lost earnings at the family level, just due to the recession. So it's not just in terms of earnings that displaced workers are seeing negative impacts. There's also research suggesting that health can be impacted, mortality. This is getting to some of probably the sociological impact of all of these things that the middle class and other workers are confronting. It even can affect the next generation. Some research suggests that if you're displaced, the likelihood of your children in the future losing a job and being on some sort of public assistance is higher. So, safety net type programs and policies are also important, not just getting people back to work, but dealing with those broader effects, which as an economist I'm not as good at evaluating the softer things. But getting back to just the long-term trend of needing to grow our economy and to figure out what is the next new job for the middle class workers. If we're not able, if the good job of the middle class was manufacturing over the past few decades, and I think I would say that the consensus among economists who study this is that most of those jobs are not coming back. And if we were to try, it would be really cost prohibitive. And so that just highlights the need for investments in education. In the short term, I think some hurdles to displace workers getting retrained are some of the benefits or subsidies for retraining programs are given to workers who are unemployed. And for middle-class workers who need to work in some job in order to provide for their family, that's just unrealistic, that they'll be able to go into unemployment in order to take advantage of some of the incentives to get retrained. So that's one thing that I think policy could address. And as Sarah mentioned, just aligning the information about programs with the programs that we think will be in the high return kind of areas, especially in STEM programs. There's some research indicating that retraining in STEM fields has like twice the return of retraining in others. And I think a lot of workers whose skills are kind of mean that they are sitting on the bench right now and they're not finding the jobs that they need, they're unaware of which areas are actually the ones that could bring the highest return for them. But thinking about beyond just retraining the workers today who are unemployed or facing potential future job losses in those fields that are just declining, we want to think about like lifetime education investments. Some striking statistics are that men in particular we've seen a stagnant progress, basically no progress in their college attainment rates. So only 26% of white males completed college in 2008, which is not that different from how it was about a decade before. The rate is higher among women, so it's particularly men whose college attainment seems to have slowed. Of course, it's even lower among African American men, 16% college attainment rate. And this is contributing to the projected skills gap that we have. My colleague Hans Johnson has done some work estimating what kind of shortfall we'll be looking at in California in terms of having the skilled workers that we need. And he estimates that we'll be 1 million workers short in the year 2025, just among college-educated workers, which is certainly going to make it more difficult to bring businesses to California based on the fact that we have this vibrant, skilled workforce. So I mean, it benefits not just the workers themselves to promote education, but also our economy writ large. And I'll echo what I think it was Scott who said, that it's not just college attainment, but it's the full range of post-secondary opportunities. And even going as far as early childhood, even before K to 12, just opportunities that equalize the potential economic progress of workers of all families across the distribution. So hopefully I answered some part of your question.
No, that's great. Sorry to put you on the spot. It's just nice to have an economist here. All right, so that'll take us to Aaron. So on this, just in case for people who may be watching this, who aren't with us physically here, the second panel is, we're same panel, but we're talking about the potential public policy solutions for California.
Sorry? Oh, okay, great. So my first comments talked a lot about the drivers that we know impact people falling out of the middle class, and now I want to talk about some of the policies that we think could be important, and particularly what Americans believe the proper role of government should be in this area. So going back to our public opinion polls, we asked people what they wanted from government, whether they felt like it was important for the government to intervene. And what we found is that they say yes, but it's this optimism that Scott mentioned, we see that really clearly. You know, almost 7 in 10 Americans say that they have achieved or will achieve the American dream. Americans think that they are in control of their economic situation. They feel nervous about what will happen to their children in terms of how difficult it will be for them to move up. But on the whole, Americans, regardless of their political persuasion or their age or their race, are really quite optimistic and believe strongly in this sense of equality of opportunity, and that the United States should be exceptional and should be a place where anyone can start poor and work hard enough to get ahead. But all of that said, they do still believe that there's a role for government to play, and that there should be more done to promote upward mobility for those in the bottom and the middle. We asked people whether government should be providing opportunities for economic advancement or preventing people from falling down, or both, and an overwhelming 83% said that they should do one of those or both. And that included 91% of Democrats, 84% of independents, and 73% of Republicans. But right now, Americans are not happy with the role of government. They think government is doing more to hurt mobility than to help it by a 52 to 27% margin. In fact, they believe that this is probably because government is helping the wrong people. 54% say that the government currently helps the rich a great deal, but only 7% said that the government helps the middle class a great deal. So what should government do? Americans are pretty united in their belief that the government should help people at the bottom and the middle, and in particular should focus on helping children get a quality education, helping promote job growth, and promote equality of opportunity. What I think is notable about our polling is that the things that Americans identify as being important align directly with the data that we have on what drives mobility. So I think it's important to keep in mind that Americans inherently know what all of our research is trying to show, that education matters, health matters, savings matter, retirement security matters, promoting small businesses matter. These are the things that Americans have said in our polls that they would like the government to be involved in. Our data can be sort of grouped into three buckets of where we feel like what are drivers of mobility. So that's social capital, human capital, and financial capital. You can think of social capital as non-financial resources available to people that help them get ahead. So it could be institutions, their neighborhood, their community, their family life. Human capital is something that would be like a skill or an attribute that helps a person take advantage of opportunities, so education or health. And financial capital are financial assets that people can leverage to help them get ahead. Since our project's inception, we have been fortunate enough to work with a group of pretty diverse think tanks in DC that represent the full scope of political opinion. We have some people that are more right-leaning, some that are more left-leaning, and some that are more centrist. And they have been integrally involved in our project from the beginning, because I think the American dream is not a concept that's owned by the right or the left. And this frame of economic mobility and equality of opportunity is something that resonates with people regardless of their political persuasion. So these stakeholders have read all of our reports, their names are on all of our reports, they have commented to us on methodology, and they've been very integrally involved in helping us develop a nonpartisan fact base about opportunity in America, with the intention that it would be policy relevant and help policymakers to make good decisions about promoting opportunity. A couple of years ago, in late 2009, during the height of the recession, these stakeholders came together under our request and came up with policy recommendations for enhancing economic mobility. We asked that they unanimously agree, and if there were any policies that someone felt uncomfortable with, that policy would be taken off the table. And we also asked that they really base their recommendations in data and fact. So either mobility data from our project or from other researchers, demonstration projects, possible policies that we were confident, that they were confident could matter for mobility. They decided among themselves that they wanted to have two basic priorities in this process. The first was that while they believe that upward mobility is important broadly, they specifically wanted to focus on upward mobility from the bottom. The second was that they believed we should have what they call the portfolio shift. So an increase in resources developed that promote mobility, but also that those policies be targeted towards people at the bottom and the middle. While their recommendations are definitely geared towards federal policymakers, I think they're applicable on the state level for a lot of reasons. Devolution makes it such that states have a lot of power to be creative and innovative, and things that happen on a state level then can be implemented by other states and sometimes then drive policy at the federal level. They focused their recommendations in those 3 buckets that I mentioned earlier: social, human, and financial capital. All of the recommendations, there are 22 of them, are on our website, so I don't need to go through all of them, but I did want to just touch on some of them, and I think they're reflective of the conversation that we've been having. So in the realm of human capital, they focused on promoting educational attainment throughout the life course, and starting as early as prenatally and pre-K, things like Head Start, all the way up through high school, dropout prevention, career academies, and post-secondary education. They also focused on helping to build the skills of low-wage workers and really focus on promoting job growth by making sure that people have the skills that they need for the jobs that are the jobs of tomorrow. I would just note here that our project just a couple of weeks ago released a summary of economic mobility comparing the United States to 9 other countries, Canada and 8 in Western Europe. And by every measure, the United States is at the bottom of the pile in terms of how likely it is that kids in the United States will look like their parents did in terms of their sort of spot in their socioeconomic status. Other countries are doing a better job of promoting mobility. And one of the most powerful findings that came out of that research was that mobility outcomes begin to be shaped as early as age 3. So we know that socioeconomic status is something that is impactful even from the very, very beginning, and policy recommendations that start as young as possible will have an impact on kids' eventual mobility outcomes. In the social capital bucket, they noted that current public assistance programs do focus on income maintenance, but not really on skills development. And so you have a situation where you can provide people an opportunity to get a job, in fact, mandate that people get a job, but that job might not be one that provides any sort of career ladder and doesn't necessarily provide a family supporting wage. So you can move people off of public assistance, but then they sort of hit a plateau where they're not going to move up the income ladder as a whole. And that, as we know, has generational impacts because people whose parents are at the bottom are likely to grow up to be in the bottom themselves. So they talked about reorienting public assistance programs to be more mobility enhancing, to provide the kind of job training that will allow people to earn a family supporting wage. They talked also about reducing teen pregnancy and promoting healthy family formation. And then also, in light of a really powerful report that we released on the impact of neighborhood poverty during childhood, they included some recommendations about place-based strategies. They talked about the success of the Harlem Children's Zone and sort of bringing programs like that to scale, trying to take evidence that we have from other places about how to improve economic development in a specific place, and that translating to mobility outcomes broadly. In the financial capital side, again, they sort of focused across the life course, ways of promoting savings from the very beginning, including child savings accounts, creating a culture of savings, and also allowing people to create their own safety net, allowing families to have assets that they can fall back on and that they can leverage not only for themselves but for their children. They talked about helping people have a secure retirement and also supporting entrepreneurship, recognizing that a lot of families at the bottom and the middle do rely on creating their own businesses, try to use entrepreneurship as a way of getting ahead, and that can be a positive way for families to move up the income ladder. And then finally, they asked for better data and evaluation metrics, both so that we can continue to have a clear sense of how people are experiencing economic mobility and opportunity, but also so that we know when policy is working and how it's working, really focusing on helping to bring effective policies to scale. So I guess I would say, if you take nothing else from my presentations today, to take this. The data on how to promote economic mobility is very clear. And moreover, economic mobility is a really unifying frame, and it's a nonpartisan frame, and it can be a really effective tool for policymakers looking to increase opportunity in the U.S. to reach across the aisle and engage a broad coalition in promoting opportunity.
Thanks, Aaron. That was terrific. Before we go to Sarah, just a comment. So much of the information we've got has been really helpful to me individually as a policymaker. One of the real frustrations I've had, because I've been at this a while, when you talk about like the Harlem Children's Zone, having just been back at Columbia University, and we had the very dynamic leader of that speak. You get individual projects and pilot projects, particularly safety net projects, that clearly work, but bringing them to scale is really difficult. And in the environment right now, for instance, there was a number of things, being a Democrat, but having been a Republican, during Pete Wilson's administration, where they actually did quite a few things that were more performance-based and evidence-based. And there was all these great little programs, Healthy Families we talked about when we were at Columbia. But bringing that to scale now when you need it most is most difficult to do because you don't have the revenue, going back to cash flow problems, to actually get them there. So it's bringing programs that obviously work. You know that they'll have good impacts. And I think of, you talk about New York Children Aid Society and all the good work they've done. And then there's a program in Kansas City called LINK, which is the Local Investment Commission, where they've sort of used the best of bottoms-up community involvement in what they want in generally low-performing schools and at-risk communities, but with the state actually putting most of the money and the federal money into it and having much better outcomes for the community, whether it's better education, better test scores, things like fatherhood, better participation in the family, lower divorce rates, lower teen pregnancies, all these things. And you look at those and go, wow, we can do these in these really tough neighborhoods. Can we bring them to scale and get them to do? And some of that I would lay at my own doorstep, because some of it is systemic inertia within large institutions to accommodate change. You know, just a rambling observation. This is fun. We should have done this in a less formal setting. If I had known we were going to not have any members here, we could have just had couches. Sarah?
Great. So in 2008, the Labor Federation brought together a lot of our 1,200 affiliates to have an economic recovery summit. And from there, we've really grappled with the issue of what California can do to get us out of this economic crisis, to get on the road to economic recovery, and to create quality jobs. So a big piece of that, we had about 5 planks. A big piece of that was education and training, and that's been touched on. But the one kind of piece of caution I would have with just throwing money into education is making sure that it does match jobs, that we're not just training people and putting them out there into an economy where they're just going to be working at Walmart. And one of the things that we found with some of these WIBs, the Workforce Investment Boards, is a lot of the people were just being placed into service sector jobs. There's not a sense that job training should be almost like career training, that we are training people for something that is going to be a career where they have advancement. So we are kind of keeping our eye on how we can make sure that, as the senator knows, workforce investment dollars are accountable and actually putting people to work. So some of our ideas in terms of policy, state policy, to help create good jobs that will bring back the middle class is really starting at the very basics, which is, again, actually a bill that the senator ran and we sponsored, which is to make California an easy place to do business. Right now we have a lot of economic development resources that are scattered across 100 agencies, boards, different regulatory agencies, as Scott mentioned, kind of all over the place. But we don't have one central portal, one phone number, one website even, that a business can call to get assistance. And so something that Labor has started to support is the idea of rolling out the red carpet and not red tape. So having one place where business can come to the state to be able to set up as quickly as possible, because we also want to get people to work as quickly as possible. And so we've been exploring partnerships with management, with the Manufacturing Association, and hopefully at some point the other side of the aisle, so that we can start putting this into place and just really start marketing California. And like the senator said, there's incredible benefits, and this is a really great place to do business for a number of reasons, and so we want to make sure that message gets out to business. One thing we've actually suggested is, rather than our legislators going to Texas, is that they do a jobs tour of California.
I didn't go to Texas.
I know. Lieutenant Governor did. But he could now do, perhaps on a train or high-speed rail, do a tour of California to kind of highlight what we've done. And the other piece is figuring out how we can increase the investment we have in infrastructure, put people back to work, and also start repairing what makes our state a great place to do business. We have an incredible infrastructure system. Right now, 12% of our bridges are about to fall down and are in hugely disastrous shape. If we can find the investment to be able to put people back to work doing that, we can start putting some of our construction workers back to work. And some of the ideas we've had to do that is around CalPERS and harnessing some of the incredible investment funds that we have, our retirement investments, and seeing if they can increase the amount that they invest in California, which was something that was done back in, I believe, 2004 with a Green Wave project, which really tried to make sure CalPERS was investing in environmentally responsible businesses, but they also did a program of retrofitting all of CalPERS real estate, which resulted not only in 40% energy savings, but created 5,000 jobs, and that increase of 5,000 jobs. So that's a piece of it. The other is looking at what we do spend in California and figuring out how we can use that spending, either on goods and services or procurement dollars, to create jobs. So part of that is, can we do bid preferences to make sure that when we're spending money, those goods are manufactured, or the services are California-based? Can we do, as part of the bid process, jobs impact statements, where if you say a company is going to create X number of quality jobs in California, can they get some kind of points, an advantage to get that, be able to bid for the contract from the state of California? And also, is there any way that we can make sure companies are accountable of keeping jobs in California after they get either tax breaks, contracts, grants, any other kind of taxpayer dollars? So making sure that we are effective in targeting the money we do spend on job creation in California. The other piece of that is looking at all the patents. California is a powerhouse for patents, and we do get 50% of venture capital, but very little of that goes to manufacturing. We still do have an edge in manufacturing because we have such an incredibly skilled workforce that I think there are pieces of manufacturing that we can still do here in terms, especially lithium-ion batteries, some of the energy storage devices, and especially if we want to bring back manufacturing of electric cars in California, which has started with Tesla, some of that manufacturing can stay here. So is there any way that we can use all the patents generated in California to both require that jobs stay here as well as our quality jobs? And that's something other states like Hawaii have started to experiment with, leveraging our kind of creative innovation for job creation. I talked a little bit about healthcare. Another thing we are interested in is capital. We sponsored a bill around a revolving loan fund to allow manufacturers to have access to capital, both for expansion, but also so they can retrofit to meet the requirements of AB 32. And we're interested in any kind of funds within the state for low-interest loans to get businesses on track with standards in terms of job quality. And then the other piece is that in order to do any of this, we do need revenue. So we are interested in revenue enhancements, figuring out how we can bring more revenue in, and also reforming our tax code, modernizing it, and closing some of the tax breaks that are no longer effective, and making sure that if we are giving away tax breaks, that they are creating jobs and benefiting our economy. And then the other piece is really looking at this whole risk shift that we talked about, and all of the risk being put back on individuals, and figuring out how we can both preserve pensions for the public sector, attack some of the worst abuses, but make sure we have fundamental defined benefit pensions, and also what can we do to guarantee a secure retirement for the private sector. And there's been a lot of talk, the UC Berkeley Labor Center has done a lot of work around, is there anything CalPERS or the state can do in terms of helping pool risk and provide either defined benefit or hybrid defined benefit, defined contribution, pension-like retirement things for private sector, so that small business could be able to provide these benefits to workers without assuming all of the risk and cost. And then the other piece of that is we are watching very closely the implementation of the ACA, of Affordable Care Act, in California, making sure that we have a very active health benefits exchange, that it works for individuals, for the sole proprietors, and that we also have a strong shop exchange so that small business can provide and can afford to provide health care for their employees. Because I know that's a huge drain on business. It's a huge strain for unions at the table. And we know that there's a common interest of making sure that we control costs in health care. And then the other piece, we would just say that to preserve job quality, that we make sure that we're really cracking down on the underground economy, on the misclassification of independent contractors, and on subcontracting in the contingent workforce, and just making sure as we're trying to build the middle class, we're holding the ground on the standards that we do have. So we're hoping we can nibble along the edges of being able to do some job creation and economic recovery in California.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Scott?
I find Sarah's comments absolutely incredible because I agree with every one of them.
Now, see, we've got business and labor here.
I am sure.
A kumbaya moment.
I am
Small
sure,
because though.
Small. Well, we could have invited the chamber.
I'm sure that the devil's in the details,
Yeah,
however.
of course.
Because I would have hit a lot of these areas. Starting on kind of a global look, a couple of things that I sense with small business, but I think it goes beyond just small businesses. We would like to see a functional government. We'd like
So would I.
this partisan bickering and it's on both sides, is just so frustrating to deal with. And I think to get things done, there's got to be more view on what's right for the people of California as opposed to what's right for the politics of it. So I don't know exactly what you can do about that, but it's a frustration out there. The second thing is, and this does kind of bother me, and it was mentioned before by you, was this aspect of everything about California business is bad, and I think that needs to be changed. There are a lot of problems in California. You mentioned the Economic Council or whatever in Contra Costa that you talked to. Well, I talked to another economic group in Contra Costa about 3 weeks ago, and I started from the premise of when you look at the California surveys, you'll find on some, or how California compares with the rest of the country, you'll find on some that California will be the 50th in the country. Those surveys generally look at taxation, regulation, cost of home ownership, those types of things. California is always going to come at the bottom. However, if you look at different indicators, a few years ago, Michigan did a study similar, but they used a different methodology, and California was the tops in the country. If you use things like venture capital, quality of weather, creativeness, skilled workforce, if you use that as your basis, California is going to be a little bit different. The problem that you've got is, in my opinion, is both sides want to make their point, but they don't want to recognize that both sides have legitimate problems, and they're too busy trying to make their point, as opposed to, okay, this is good, this is bad, let's try to figure out a way to deal with it. I don't see a lot of that out there, and certainly the business community is as guilty as anybody else in this, in some organizations more so than others. So that would be my global comments, if you will. As far as looking at the various issues, and Sarah mentioned it, it really is critical that the exchanges from a small business perspective, that the exchanges with the SHOP program and that they work. If you talk to small business people in the past and said, how would you solve the problem with health care and affordable health care, the first thing that would generally come out is you would pool small businesses, and that's kind of the concept that you have with the exchanges. It's a little strange, however, and I still think there's a lot of possibility. It's a little strange, however, that any rates that are charged within the exchange have to be available outside the exchange. It kind of seems like that defeats the purpose of trying to get a better. I understand why, because they're trying to get at the flip side, that you can't have competition outside the exchange that destroyed the PAC Advantage program. But having said that, the aspect, I think what's important for the exchange to do is first of all, it's got to be sure that there doesn't have adverse selection, and I think that's what killed PAC Advantage. That's got to be addressed. But it also has to be available for small businesses to evaluate cost and quality, and have a source. I do think insurance brokers play a role here also, but insurance brokers can't deal with all the people out there. I think there needs to be a good foundation. People can go to insurance brokers, and I am an insurance broker. So, people can go to insurance brokers, but the exchange has a definite place as far as information. Make it simple for small businesses. But I think what's really critical, because at the end of the day, if ACA is going to work, there's got to be cost control. All the other stuff is good, but unless there's cost control, unless we get to a system where there's pay for performance and there's cost savings that are built into the system that currently don't exist, the whole thing's going to fail. So, in fact, I'm currently working on an op-ed piece on what are the cost control possibilities within the accountable care organization is certainly a good example of one. The whole pay for performance aspect of those things really need to be focused on for the exchange to be effective and the whole accountable care act to be effective. We do have one thing that is going to solve a problem nationally. California didn't have anything to do with it, but the fact that it's guaranteed issue, that will address the sole proprietor issue. Exactly, I said education, I just echo what Sarah said, is really critical, and investment in education. That was our number 2 issue. Number 3 was infrastructure. I ditto what Sarah said on that one. This whole capital access issue, big issue, and admittedly, California can do only so much. I don't think they're doing enough right now. They can do only so much because so much is determined by the federal regulators. However, what we are recommending, and we would really appreciate any help you might be able to give us, Senator, is we are proposing that the governor hold a conference, or not a conference, because I don't think a conference would be productive, hold a meeting. So this would not be a wide open public meeting with all kinds of, where people couldn't be free to express themselves. But hold a meeting. The governor invite Karen Mills from the SBA, who, by the way, Karen Mills just made a statement last week that the regional regulators are misinterpreting federal regulators and being much more restrictive. Her comment right there is what I'd like to get to. So what we'd like to do is have the SBA, the Comptroller, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and bankers, and I may have forgotten one, and bring them all into a room and have a frank discussion of how do we expand capital to small businesses. Because what you've got right now is the banks say, well, we want to make loans, but we can't make, we want to make loans, but when we make a loan, the regulators slap our hands for it. I'd like to have the regulators there and have a discussion about how they can open up the channels of communication and break down some of the barriers that are occurring. The other aspect in the access to capital, and this is going to be a piece of legislation by Small Business California, is we have got to get out of the aspect of the only capital available is through the banks. We've got to be able to get to the capital marketplaces, and we can't do it right now. There's a provision right now that prohibits, and maybe you've seen some of this because they've gone after these people, it prohibits in raising money. You can go to a brokerage firm, but if somebody wants $500,000, they're not going to be overly interested in doing anything. So what we'd like to do is have an ability for people to raise money, going out to and the proviso that they have is they have to know the people. The problem small business has is they're not going to necessarily know everybody. They're not in the country clubs and that type of thing. We would like to have the ability of these companies being able to raise money to do solicitation with the proviso that the only people, and this goes different than the Crowd Act, it's back in Washington, I think that needs some tightening, but with the proviso that the people that make investments, and they're limited up to $1 million or something like that, and 10% of their net worth, but have to be accredited investors. So that's the protection mechanism, and that is a piece of legislation. The federal government allows that right now under 504, Provision 504, but each state has to implement its own program to take advantage of it. There are 5 or 6 states that have done it, so that is something we're going to introduce, and I think we've got to get past just banks being the lenders to small business. The venture capital money is important to some degree, but not for small business. Those very limited number of loans, I've heard the average is $8 million. That's not what small business needs. Not to say that it's not important, but venture capital isn't the answer. There is a program out there that we think is really important, and I don't know what you can do on a state basis except to work with federal legislators, especially in the House, and that's the Small Business Innovative Research Program, which is a program to take the people that were mentioned in the entrepreneurs, the research and development people, and actually develop something from the research and development. And they have grants, and the grants that are provided are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 1 being the research and development, phase 2 being the build out, and phase 3 being commercialization. That program's been around for a long time, been extremely successful by any criteria, and we're caught in a battle right now with the venture capital, with the biotechs, and with the universities to a program that now is just getting continuing resolution for the last 5 years. We need to have stable money, authorization of this money over a period of 5 to 8 years. And we're caught into these battles. And where you could help there is, especially in the House, the legislators from California, if there's any way to encourage them to support the Senate bill on this issue. I think it's 493, but I could get that for you. But get that program reauthorized so it's not on continuing resolution. That would be very, very helpful. As far as the regulation area, again, I think what would be helpful is, get rid of the bad regulations. And some of them that are, there's a situation right now that to show you the absurdity. If a business does a emergency action plan and they do a fire prevention program, well, if they don't do one, they're fine. They don't have to do it. However, if they do one and it doesn't conform with Cal OSHA rules, which nobody knows out there for a small business, you're subject to fines. Now, that makes no sense. It is crazy to tell somebody, if you try, we're going to fine you. But if you don't do anything, that's fine. I'm working on that one. But those are kind of regulations that are just crazy. I'm in the insurance business to comply with the secure privacy information. I have a 53-page handbook on how to deal with motor vehicle information. 53 pages. That kind of stuff is crazy. But of more importance is what I mentioned before.
Only 53?
53 babies. The aspect that I mentioned before, though, the one-stop shop, trying to do that, trying to cut across agencies, not saying get rid of them, but cut through the bureaucracy, and get a single point that they can call or some reference that they can use. That would be extremely helpful. In the taxation area, certainly support hiring tax credits and those kind of things. I think it should be very targeted. I like some of the aspects of California businesses and some of the looks. I think that's real positive. Not sure how it looks exactly, but those kind of things I think are important. We'd also like to see a startup tax credit, which doesn't exist in California and exists in a number of states around the country. And the last one, we could go through a lot of them, but the last one that you could be very helpful is in the energy arena. Small Business California was a unique organization. We were probably the first, if not the first, one of the first generic business organizations to support AB 32. We supported it because we thought that we needed to deal. We thought there was a problem. We thought it's better to deal with it on a planned basis than a crisis basis. And then from a very selfish perspective, we know that small business wastes a lot of energy. It's not because we want to. We don't know what to do about it. So we were hoping that resources would come into small business to assist them in taking advantage of energy conservation, and do it on the basis of they're not going to do it to save energy because that's the right thing to do. Again, they think that, but that's not what's going to make them do it. What's going to make them do it is it's a good business decision. So set up things that are good business decisions. And we've got a program called on-bill financing. And on-bill financing, unfortunately, the CPUC has required all the energy companies to implement on-bill the IOUs, on-bill financing. San Diego has done a great job. PG&E and Southern California Edison have been pretty awful, haven't done much. What on-bill financing is a small business has an energy audit, and it says if you do this, this, and this, you can save $20,000. But in order to do this, this, and this, or in order to get that savings, you've got to do something, and let's say that costs $10,000. What on-bill financing is the small business is given $10,000, and the payback to the and it's on the energy bill. The payback is through the savings in the energy bill. They get a loan for 3 to 5 years at 0% financing. To qualify for the loan, they need to be with the utility for 2 or 3 years and be current on their energy bill. That's it. No credit check, no bank statement, no bank information. So the first thing you say is, okay, that sounds really tough because there's going to be a whole lot of defaults. Well, San Diego Gas has done over 800 of these loans. They're not all paid back. They're $20 million, $13 million has been paid back, and the failure rate so far has been, I think it's 6 or 7 months. We know that these things will get paid back. The default rate will be less than 1%. We were successful in getting it in the 2007 energy bill as part of the energy bill to support on-bill financing. We now have a relationship with the SBA, and we got the SBA to appoint the regional administrator to be the point person for the SBA in implementing small business energy policy, so we have that in place. But any help in that area would be greatly appreciated, and working with Elizabeth Eccles, who's the head of the regional administrator from the SBA, we would like to do that. We've got a lot of things we want. But
Well, if you need an author for that earlier bill, we'd be happy to talk to you about it and all the other things. Actually, time-wise, we've spent a lot of the time that we had anticipated. It's about 3:30, so I won't belabor my Oprah Winfrey impersonation. But I did, just as long as I have you all here, one thing that is we look at a brave new world, whatever that world is, and I look at my children and prospectively their grandchildren. So what are the jobs of the future for California? I've heard people say, employers, I think the chairman of General Electric, I heard him recently say, we're making old arguments that we're not going to have the workforce we currently have in the future. So, and I go back to the Wealth and Democracy book by Kevin Phillips, and he talked about America shouldn't move to just be a financial services economy, because you look at what the British did and the Dutch did, it didn't work well. At some point you have to actually manufacture and produce something. But I hear that it's in healthcare, and we talked about stem cell research. Do any of you have any research about what are the jobs of the future? And continuing education clearly is part of this. Sarah, when we talked about manufacturing, we talk about, for instance, the German culture in manufacturing. The one thing that comes up over and over again is their continuing education, of whether you're a line worker for one of the auto manufacturers or you're doing research and development, and that they have it in their culture. So I guess the two things, amongst the many things I take from all of the things you've said, is education and continuing education, because the workforce has to constantly be retrained. And since Sarah's actually pulling out a graph, apparently PPIC's done some studies about this, about what is the workforce of the future and what are we training people for in an economy that we know is very dynamic and changing all the time.
Well, I just pulled out some figures that we have looked at from the California California Employment Development Department, looking at what sectors are projected to have the highest growth rates in California. And you're right, the service sectors are projected to be the fastest growing. Educational services, professional services, which includes doctors and those kind of services, as well as business services. Healthcare, of course, which goes along with the demographic shift that we're in the midst of. Hospitality, arts, entertainment, recreation is another fast growing. I think if you actually look at the statistics on the finance and insurance industry, which is
very small,
it's actually projected to be very small, 1.8% projected growth in employment for that sector. So that means that perhaps we're not going towards a financier only kind of market. But construction and manufacturing is projected to have negative employment growth over the next about 6 to 8 years.
Sarah, do you have anything? I mean, one of the things that we hear all the time about the union movement is that nationally it's way down, as you said. But if you take away public employment unions, it's in the private sector, it's way, way down. You have any projections as to where growth might be? Both the question about what new jobs might be, but what's the future of the union movement? And a lot of, I argue with people fairly regularly about the importance of the union movement. One of the things I feel very strongly is this country is about balancing concentrations of power. And my own belief is there's been when you look at, and I digress a little bit, but in the context of things, it's not digressing. So I listen to all of you and the complexity and the nature of my job, and then I think about how we get elected and what people retain and how people who are running for office. It's, Scott, a little bit what you talked about getting things done. But in a political world, too often it's sort of the mentality of what's somebody going to put on a mailer or a one-piece gotcha of the horrible thing you might have done. So maybe that's part of the discussion about the middle class's civic engagement. Now people realize all of this is connected. And I don't know the answer to that, but I guess that it's just people having meetings like this and exponentially, not exponentially, but slowly but surely getting people more knowledgeable. But Sarah, anyways, I started with a question about you, the future of the union movement, and what are the new jobs that you folks are looking for?
Well, definitely healthcare is huge. I mean, we already have strong unions in healthcare, and we're expecting it to expand. And we're also looking at jobs that can't be shipped off. So we're looking at logistics chains everywhere from how do you go from the port to a truck to a Walmart, the distribution centers, which are huge. I mean, Amazon is going to be moving in soon to California. And then also agricultural and related industries. I mean, California has a very strong agricultural industry, and we're expecting that to stay. And so there is, there's not only growers, but it's very sophisticated. You have coolers, you have distributors, you have then the truckers and the packers. I mean, there is a whole logistics chain in agriculture. So we're looking at how we can also use some of the recent legislation and start organizing more in those areas. And we do have faith that California, through policy, can expand manufacturing. I don't think that it's inevitable. I think the companies made choices about where they were going to have their products built and allowed for that technology to be outsourced. But there's no reason that California can't use our technological innovation to do advanced manufacturing, light manufacturing, battery manufacturing. So I think it is focusing on how we can retool and make sure that that happens. I know Michigan, even though they're not in the best state, has done some really innovative work on retooling their auto factories and using their existing supply chains to do battery manufacturing. We could easily do that here if we had a manufacturing policy. So we definitely have faith in policy to shape the economy.
Well, I want to thank again all of you. Thank you for all of your presentations. Thank you for putting up with my talk show host chairmanship. And we've got one more item on the agenda, public comment, but before we go to that, I just want to, all of these things, or if people who are watching at home or online have suggestions, please contact us. You can go to the state website and go to our particular website. We have a link on the video, I'm being told. So if you have specific suggestions with the idea that this is a starting point in this discussion about how we can rebuild a robust middle income that has a great deal of mobility and success and all the things that the Pew Foundation talked about in terms of the American dream and the sustainability of the American dream, which, as Scott said and I share, is a nonpartisan, and as Aaron said, is a nonpartisan issue. So we appreciate your attendance, and we will go to public comment. Is there anyone in the public who would like to comment? Sure.
I got like 3 questions.
Let's find out where you're going.
My name's Dan.
Dan, why don't you sit right here so we have you on the record? Thank you, Leroy.
Is your business services or?
I'm an insurance broker.
Okay.
So if we can have a seat, Dan, and just give us the questions, and then we'll try to respond to them when you're finished.
Senator.
Why don't you give them us all so we can absorb all
Well,
of
yeah,
it.
but it has to do with your former business.
Mhm.
If you were able to give lower wages to your employees, would your dinners have been cheaper?
Okay, why don't you give us all your questions?
Yeah,
If you got-
it has to do with how much does a person's wages at a company dictate the bill for like a restaurant? So obviously it probably would be cheaper, right?
when you do a profit and loss statement in the restaurant business, you look at your cost of goods.
Yeah, and that's
part
the
of it.
wages is part of the cost, right?
So
Yeah.
my own belief is you work on percentages, whether you're a big company or a small one.
And the heart of this new infrastructure we're building for the middle class, would green technology be pretty much like a keystone in it? All right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's 1, 2.
And if you could lower a person's wages and still not financially disrupt their family life, would that be good? To pay lower wages but still not financially disrupt the family life?
Okay.
Okay. I worked on a paper this past week that kind of encompasses all that. And I would like to give it to you.
Okay.
I thought all the senators were going to be here.
There's only 40 of us in the whole state.
No, I mean
so-
all the senators there's like five
Yeah.
of them, right?
We weren't able to.
Yeah.
This is, because of the holidays in particular, it starts to get a busy time of the year, I think, personally, for everybody, whether you have a title or not. But if you give us that, Dan, that'd be great. Anything else?
No, that's about it.
Okay. I don't know if anybody else has a comment, but lower wages don't necessarily mean cheaper dinners.
No, I mean, like if you're paying your employee cheaper wages, lower wages, then could you like give cheaper, I mean, the price of the dinner could be cheaper?
I know I never had that occasion. My wages
Yeah, I
are
know you
always
never
going up.
had- I know you never had them, but it encompasses,
No, I appreciate it. Well, we're happy to try to answer all these questions for you. I think the answer to the questions are, in a general sense, green technology is a big part of, when we talk about those venture capital that's coming into California, my understanding, quite a bit of that, the majority of that's going towards renewable and new technology, green technology, because we've got a lot of research in that regard in the state, and people are betting that most of the development will be here in the state. The relationship between wages and, so since I was persisting on trying to get economists to comment on sociological changes, wages and disruption on families, I think that's, people want to have, from my experience, one thing about being nonpartisan is if you have people with good wages and disposable income, that's good for business. That's part of the thing that's made, as Scott said, on some of the business survey, that's why this is a great place to open a business, because people in our best moments have good wages and benefits. Therefore, they have disposable income and they go out and spend it, and that's good for everybody. Generally, where there are lower wages around the world, at least in my experience in reading, it's just as a liberal arts major, is the sociological impacts, most of the benchmarks for quality of life are not as good. So that's one of the challenges I think we have in California is when I hear good things about Southeast Asian and Asian and Chinese people having a better quality of life, we're all pleased by that. It's just at what expense does that come from for Americans? So thank you for your comments and questions. Anyone else, public comment? Well, we thank you very much again, particularly the panelists, for being here, and we're adjourned.